Hey fam, so I received a channeled message that I wrote down and thought I would share. If I have time to pull some cards in this video, I will do as well. If not, it'll be in the next one. But I felt like Source wanted me to bring attention to our assumptions that we make. So the question that I wrote was, what assumptions are you making about other people, situations? I wrote, ask questions first, even when it's people you know. Try not to assume how someone is feeling or what their actions will be, etc. Out of familiarity or judgment. What are you basing your preconceived notions on? So yeah, I feel like there are some of us, I guess it's a collective message that used to making assumptions, and Source is wanting us to reflect on where those assumptions are coming from, whether it's assumptions we're making about family, friends, people we don't know. Is it based off of what you think you would do? So if you're looking at someone else and assuming something, is it because you feel like you would do that, so you're assuming that they would do that or think that or feel that? Or assumptions can also be based off of your own experiences, I'm hearing, like past experiences, even like a trauma response. Yeah, so like maybe you've been through something traumatic and you're expecting someone to act the same way. That can also be tied to our assumptions of other people. Is your assumption that you're making based on what you know on the person or even their past version of themselves? That could also be a dangerous thing because you're used to someone being a certain way, then they could have evolved or changed from that. So Source is saying to be mindful in that regard. Also, our assumptions based on just purely judgments, looking at someone's appearance, looking at, okay, they look this way, so they must act like this. I wrote that it's time for us to take time to notice when we are assuming and bringing that mirror back to ourselves for a second or two. So even if we're just spending a little bit of time in our days, so noticing when these assumptions come up and not judging ourselves for assuming, because I don't know, the way that things are set up, I feel like I'm hearing like there are just so many boxes in society and within the world, and so it's so easy to assume certain things are a certain way. But I think Source is wanting to challenge us a little bit to notice when we are making an assumption about someone or something, and just bringing that mirror back to ourselves. So spending, like, even if it's a few minutes thinking, okay, why did I think that of that person? Even like, this is an example that I will give of that I've experienced quite a few times. So for example, like in friendships, I feel like something I've experienced is that when people become familiar with me, they will assume how I'm feeling, but it's more so in a way of relating. Like, I don't feel like it's coming from a place of like negativity or anything. And I think that that's what Source also wanted to bring up through my own reflections, was that these assumptions might not be coming from an overly unharmonious or negative place, but Spirit is saying that there is still some awareness that's needed for ourselves in general. Yeah, like you might be friends with someone and they might just assume how you're feeling, or tie their own feelings into your feelings when you actually don't feel that way at all. So yeah, I think it's important to take that time. I also wanted to say assumption is not intuition. So an assumption is when you don't really actually have any backing or anything that has shown you that, yes, your spiritual intuition can show you things without any like physical or tangible proof. So those two things can maybe get a bit confusing, especially within the spiritual journey, like assuming something assumptions, judgment, and intuition, sometimes people can get confused with the voice. One thing I will say is that our spiritual intuition is really not that loud. I feel like an assumption can be very loud. An assumption can be like, yeah, that's very loud and sure, or seemingly sure. I hope that makes sense. But intuition is very like gentle in my personal experience, and is not like overpowering and not forceful. Whereas I feel like an assumption is a lot more, I don't know if I'd use the word harsh in that way, but maybe that could be a word that explains it. Yeah, so even if there is an intuitive feeling that you're having, it's really, really important and appropriate to ask questions to gain clarity on your inkling. Because sometimes you could have an intuitive feeling, but you could also have an assumption that is kind of like matching up with it. And we might not be differentiating between the two, or things might be like interweaving in and out of each other, if that makes sense. So it's really important to ask questions. I find in my relationships, in terms of my own self making assumptions, and I also find that with other people making assumptions when it comes to me. So, ask someone how they're feeling, or being like, hey, I was feeling like maybe you were feeling this way. Am I on point with that, or am I just making an assumption? There's no shame in asking those kinds of questions. I also feel like in relationships as well, we can make assumptions. When you make an assumption about how someone is feeling, or the action that what the action they are doing means, and you can take on that projection when really, and it can like make you feel low or make you feel sad or a certain way about yourself. And then you go back and actually have a conversation with them, and you realize, oh, they weren't even feeling that way at all. So assumptions can also make us waste our time and our energy where it's not needed. And I also feel like we learn a lot more about people this way, when we actually ask questions rather than assuming. And we also learn a lot more about ourselves.